Wonderful. Good afternoon, and welcome to all of you to this series of monthly online lectures discussing Joseph Ratzinger's landmark work, The Spirit of the Liturgy, hosted by the Society for Catholic Liturgy. I'm Father Michael Wirtz. I serve as the secretary of the Society and the moderator for today's lecture. A reminder that our lecture today is being recorded, and also we will not hold a Q&A session after today's talk. But if you would like to keep the conversation going, I would invite you to keep an eye on the Society's website for details of our 2025 annual conference, which will be held at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. next September. The conference is titled The Spirit of the Liturgy, the Liturgical Legacy of Joseph Ratzinger-Benedict XVI. The inspiration for the conference comes from the fact that Ratzinger's impactful book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, marks its 25th anniversary this year. Our website, liturgysociety.org/spirit25, has posted our call for papers. And I would encourage you, please, to submit proposals, abstracts of a paper proposal, and those are due on April the 1st. There's more information again on our website, liturgysociety.org/spirit25. It gives you instructions of to whom to send the abstract proposals to and to whom to email it, etc. Lastly, next month will be our 7th installment in this series. So please mark your calendars for Thursday, April the 3rd at 4 o'clock Eastern, when Father James Bradley, our Society's president, will speak on the 8th chapter of the Spirit of the Liturgy, entitled The Reservation of the Blessed Sacrament. If you missed our previous lectures, they are available on our YouTube channel, which can be found at youtube.com/@liturgysociety. Our aim with this lecture series is to hear from a range of experts across various disciplines related to the sacred liturgy, each helping us to probe more deeply the 12 chapters of Ratzinger's very fine and important book. Today's presentation is on the 6th chapter of the Spirit of the Liturgy, entitled The Altar and the Direction of Liturgical Prayer, and is given by Father Ryan Ruiz. Father Ryan was ordained a priest for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati in May of 2008. He currently serves as the vice rector and the director of formation and the director of liturgy, and an associate professor of liturgy and sacraments, and formation faculty member at Mount St. Mary's Seminary and School of Theology, the Athenaeum of Ohio in Cincinnati, having also served as its dean of the School of Theology there from 2019 to 2024. In 2011, Father Ruiz was assigned to graduate studies in Rome, Italy, where he received his doctorate in sacred liturgy from the Pontifical Liturgical Institute of San Anselmo in 2016. In January of 2020, he was appointed as a consultant to the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Divine Worship. In 2021, Father Ruiz was named Archiepiscopal Delegate for matters related to the traditional Latin Mass, and likewise serves as a censor laborum for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. He is a member of the Society for Catholic Liturgy and also serves on our board of directors. Father Ruiz has been a visiting lecturer at the Liturgical Institute at Mundelein, at the Catholic University of America, and at the Institute for Liturgical Formation at Christendom College. He is the author of various scholarly essays and assists with several committees and ministerial needs of the local church. And so it is my pleasure to welcome Father Ryan Ruiz to address us today.
Thank you, Father Wirtz, for the introduction. In his recently published posthumous work, What is Christianity? The Last Writings, Pope Benedict XVI reflected briefly on his overwhelmingly liturgical approach to theology. After having commented on a statement in St. Benedict's rule that nothing should be preferred to the work of God, the late Holy Father described his analysis of the perceived misunderstandings that have arisen in the Church's liturgy following the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. In his estimation, the increasing prominence of instruction, ministerial activity, and creativity in the liturgy have, quote, almost made us forget the presence of God, end quote. Pope Benedict then concludes that in such a situation, it can become increasingly clear that the existence of the Church is vitally dependent on the correct celebration of the liturgy, and that the Church is in danger when the primacy of God no longer appears in the liturgy, and thus in life. The most profound reason for the crisis that upsets the Church lies in the eclipse of God's priority in the liturgy. In relating these sentiments, we find an avenue for us to reflect on Pope Benedict's treatment of the present topic of today's lecture, the placement of the altar in our churches, and the orientation by which the sacred ministers stand at it to offer fitting praise and worship to God the Father through the Son and the Spirit. Our goal in this lecture is to re-examine the third chapter of part 2 of the Spirit of the Liturgy and highlight both its content and the perennial lessons found therein, especially for the contemporary church's execution of the Opus Dei. As we are well aware, this topic, has the power to elicit strong opinions from diverse segments of the church. The centrality of the altar and the singular act that takes place on it is a key consideration on both sides of the divide. And the orientation of the priest celebrant who stands at it is taken to be a vital indicator of essential theological characteristics, not only of the Church's sacred liturgy, but also of her very nature as the mystical body of Christ. The approach taken by Joseph Ratzinger is to this, in every liturgical question, is to aid the Church's understanding of the faith by helping her understand, quote, its central form of expression in the liturgy, end quote. Ultimately, then, the topic under consideration is an ecclesiological as well as liturgical one, since, as Pope Benedict reaffirms in his last writings, a, quote, true renewal of the liturgy is a fundamental prerequisite for the renewal of the Church, end quote. Regarding this topic of how we properly orient ourselves in prayer at the altar of God, the state of the question is a relatively modern one, drawn from insights from the 20th century liturgical movement and further concretized by the post-conciliar liturgical reform. The tendency amongst some contemporary scholars to place two important vantage points, tradition and renewal, in opposition to each other, has been an unintended consequence of the advances in late 19th, early 20th century liturgical scholarship and its application in the lived reality of the Church. As is well known, Ratzinger and those who similarly subscribe to the logic of continuity find such a dichotomy between tradition and renewal untenable. For Ratzinger, a proper liturgical methodology, while demanding an exegesis of the living reality of the Church, finds this reality not merely exemplified in the de jure or de facto principles of the present moment, but in the lived reality of the Church of all times, that of today and that of yesterday, and especially that of the Church Fathers and of the medieval period. This approach to continuity applies to the layout of the sacred space of our church buildings, a topic already expertly analyzed in the prior lecture in this series by Chris Carstens. An essential source that Ratzinger uses to guide his thoughts on the topic is the learned 20th century theologian Louis Boyer. In Boyer's book, Liturgy and Architecture, we find a historical survey of the various locations taken up by the altar from antiquity to the present day. In his characteristically acerbic style, Boyer does not shy away from giving his own pointed critique of the historical development, as when, for example, he comments on the adoption of the basilica for liturgical use, wherein the bishop's cathedra replaced the altar as the central focus in the apse, causing the bishop, in Boyer's mind, to appear as a great lord, and the other ministers surrounding him as, quote, an impressive array of flunkies, enhancing his own dignity while separating it from the vulgum pecus, end quote. An additional example of Boyer's sardonic voice is found in the rationale given for why this adoption of the basilica style for Christian churches occurred in the first place. What caused Pope Paschal I to move the pontifical throne to the apse behind the altar was, Boyer comments, his displeasure at hearing the women behind his back, commenting upon what he said to his deacons, end quote. What Boyer is referencing here in this commentary is that in an earlier arrangement of the church architecture, the bishop's cathedra was found on a type of beam on the nave of the church that would have been surrounded by the curious faithful, some of whom were undoubtedly looking to catch wind of the latest ecclesial gossip. And it's comforting to know that not much has changed in the church in this regard. However, in the midst of his critiques, Boyer actually offers an important detail connecting the organic development of the altar in the church building to the church's perennial tradition. In spite of the modification of the bishop's throne to the center of the apse, the primitive Constantinian basilica, from Boyer's perspective, kept as much as possible of the more primitive disposition of Christian churches, where even though the bishop had taken to himself the primitive place of the altar's position was still the central focus and had lost nothing of its dignity. However, it's less with the placement of the altar and more with the placement of the minister at the altar that Ratzinger utilizes Boyer's insights. For example, Ratzinger quotes Boyer's reflection on the anachronistic view that some scholars have had in claiming that the Last Supper would have been celebrated by the Lord versus populum. For Boyer, such a claim fails to find substantiation in the basic facts of the historical record. Tables for meals in antiquity did not place the host on one side and the banqueters on the other, but rather, as Ratzinger quotes Boyer's insight, the communal character of a meal was emphasized just by the opposite disposition, the fact that all the participants were on the same side of the table. A benefit to Ratzinger's reliance on Boyer in this regard is that Boyer himself relied on other eminent scholars like Cyril Vauger, whose reflection about the lone insistence that the primitive church had in worship was the directionality of prayer towards the east, was taken into Ratzinger's own discussion in this chapter about this particular topic and how it relates to the sacrificial character of Christian worship. Thus, from the perspective of one of the interlocutors Ratzinger engages in this chapter of the Spirit of the Liturgy, the question regarding the orientation of liturgical prayer is a fairly settled convention rooted in the Church's most ancient tradition. However, it is at this point in the discussion that we more fully encounter Ratzinger's academic objectivity and the modern exponent to the state of the question. For the other principal interlocutor that Ratzinger invokes in this chapter, the Benedictine scholar Angelus Hausling, takes a fairly strong ad contra position to the seemingly settled convention regarding the directionality of liturgical prayer. Ratzinger references Hausling's critique of his methodological approach beginning on page 81 of the 2000 Ignatius Press edition of The Spirit of the Liturgy. Here, Ratzinger notes that the material he has thus presented in this chapter, material, mind you, that he had presented in other venues prior to the publication of The Spirit of the Liturgy, had already received several objections from Hausling. Ratzinger then indicates the two principal objections raised by his German confrere. The first was the claim that Ratzinger's approach was guilty of a kind of romanticized antiquarianism that pined for the past for the mere sake of nostalgia. The second was that Ratzinger's emphasis on turning to the East was something that was ultimately a moot point, since the concept that Ratzinger was aiming for could be achieved in Hausling's mind by way of a focused attention on the people, so that, quote, when the priest and faithful look at one another, they are looking at the image of God and man, leading Hausling then to believe that, quote, facing one another is the right direction for prayer, end quote. Before turning to Ratzinger's responses to Hausling, it would be good to outline the hermeneutic used by the scholarly critic of Ratzinger. In his review of the spirit of the liturgy, published in the German language journal Archiv für Liturgiewissenschaft, Hausling focuses his critique of Ratzinger's work on two interrelated areas. The first deals with the reception of the Second Vatican Council. Recognizing Ratzinger's scholarly pedigree and his status as a high-ranking member of the Roman Curia, Hausling certainly accepts that Ratzinger's work, published as it was over 40 years after the conclusion of the council, would have an important role to play in either the reception or non-reception of the council. However, Hausling also expresses concern that, to his count, the Second Vatican Council is only directly referenced one time in the spirit of the liturgy, thus leading the German Benedictine to ponder how Ratzinger truly envisions the post-conciliar liturgical reform. This concern is further exacerbated in Hausling's mind by how Ratzinger seemingly approaches the topic of the actuosa participatio in the liturgy. In his book review, Hausling presents a typical scene from his own perspective of the celebration of Mass prior to the Council, wherein the faithful are seemingly only aware of the action of the Mass based on the location of the priest at the altar. From the right-hand side of the altar, the priest moves to the left-hand side of the altar, causing the people to stand for the reading of the Gospel, though without interrupting their personal prayers. And then when the priest goes to the middle of the altar, the people kneel in anticipation of the offertory. In Hausling's mind, if an outsider were to view this scene, the conclusion he would have would be that the high point of the liturgy only comes at the very end, when the priest descends the altar steps and, praying along with the people in the vernacular, leads them in the Hail Mary, the Hail Holy Queen, and the prayer of St. Michael the Archangel, the prescribed Leonine prayers at the end of Low Mass. Hausling then concludes that for the uninitiated, this would have to be considered the apex of the liturgical act, since in his mind, this is the only moment when the priest and people are praying together before God. From all of this, Hausling rhetorically asks whether Ratzinger would want to go back to this perceived means of approaching the actuosa participatio. For Hausling, the methodology of prayer found in the spirit of the liturgy is a one-sided, clerically emphasized reality that limits the faithful's ability to engage the full reality of faith, something that should be most evidently found in the sacred liturgy. Naturally, whereas this critique is principally levied at the second chapter of part 4 of the Spirit of the Liturgy, where Ratzinger outlines his treatment of the actuosa participatio, we also find a connection with our present lecture topic, since in the section dealing with the actuosa participatio, Ratzinger makes clear that the external act of, quote, doing must really stop when we come to the heart of the matter, which is the oratio, which itself makes way for the actio of God to occur, end quote. Ratzinger then goes on to say in the same section that, quote, anyone who grasps this will easily see that it is not now a matter of looking at or towards the priest, but of looking together toward the Lord and going out to meet him, end quote. In examining Ratzinger's response to Hausling's criticism concerning his methodology being perceived as a mere longing for the past, we find the familiar outline of Ratzinger's hermeneutic of continuity. As Ratzinger notes, quote, the problem with a large part of modern liturology is that it tends to recognize only antiquity as a source, and therefore normative, and to regard everything developed later in the Middle Ages and through the Council of Trent as decadent, end quote. Instead of this incomplete view of the Church, as well as an incomplete view of the essential aspect of the Church's life, the sacred liturgy, Ratzinger promotes a, quote, thoroughly living kind of development, in which a seed at the origin of something ripens and bears fruit, end quote. Thus, in direct response to Hausling's belief that the ad orientem disposition of the priest is incongruous with the contemporary liturgy, Ratzinger posits his own series of incredulous rhetorical questions. Is that really the case? Are we not interested in the cosmos anymore? Are we today really hopelessly huddled in our own little circle? Is it not important precisely today to pray with the whole of creation? Is it not important precisely today to find room for the dimension of the future, for hope in the Lord who is to come again, to recognize again, indeed to live, the dynamism of the new creation as an essential form of the liturgy? Another direct response that Ratzinger gives to Hausling pertains to the latter's belief that the aim of ad orientem worship can be achieved by man looking at man, that is, by the priest looking at the faithful and the faithful looking at the priest. Here, the rebuke of Ratzinger is even more oblique. Quote, I find it hard to believe, Ratzinger says of Hausling, that the famous critic thought this was a serious argument, end quote. Although Ratzinger obviously recognizes the image of God in man, he likewise notes that this cannot be seen in such a simplistic way. Certainly, it can be seen in man through the virtues and transcendentals, but even then, this image of God's majesty found in man has to be adjusted through the lens of the Eucharist, which demands us to view it from a different, elevated perspective. From the state of the question that is principally rooted in the context of 20th century liturgical developments, we can now look at how Ratzinger's liturgical methodology determines a priority for ad orientem worship. Much of this discussion is found in the preceding chapter of the Spirit of the Liturgy on the theological realities that comprise the church building, and that was already treated in our lecture series in the last lecture. Here, Ratzinger indicates how Christian worship not only grew out of the synagogue tradition, but amended it to create a new reality. Two principal things that were amended were the focal point of worship and the place of worship. The focal point for Christian worship was not Jerusalem, but the direction of the rising sun. This not only implied a transformed Christological and eschatological focus for worship, but it also drew the created order into salvation history, creating a truly cosmic liturgy. Similarly, the place of worship, the altar of sacrifice, which was antithetical to synagogal worship, marked for Christians the transformation of this cosmic liturgy into an eternal liturgy, where the earthly altar and the heavenly altar participate in the one sacrifice of the Son to the Father in the Holy Spirit. If we were to expand even further on topics already engaged in our lecture series, we could build on Ratzinger's treatment of the Pauline Logicae Latria, the worship and sacrifice of God with spirit and mind, which was taken up by the fathers of the church with regard to the Eucharist being a proper oratio, a proper sacrifice in the word, that then outlines man's true path towards self-identification based on his encounter with God. The liturgy then becomes the meeting place for the exitus reditus dynamic, where everything and everyone comes together. It is through this logos worship, which could also be described as logical worship, that we find all of humanity, quote, incorporated into the great historical process by which the world moves toward the fulfillment of God being all in all. This processional movement presumes a unity of mind, heart, and one might say directionality in our oratio, which is, quote, the means by which earthly time is inserted into the time of Jesus Christ and into its present, end quote. However, when treating the theological presumptions from the perspective of the present chapter under analysis, we find additional details that round out Ratzinger's earlier reflections in the prior chapter. One such detail links the universality of God with the historical details of salvation history. God is everywhere, and from the very outset of the church's existence, She understood that the fruitfulness of her communal life of prayer and the fruitfulness of the private life of prayer of her members is not completely determined by the particular place or direction of prayer, as in Judaism and Islam. As Ratzinger notes, quote, "We can indeed pray everywhere, and God is accessible to us everywhere, since Christian universality tells us that the God who embraces the cosmos is more intimate to us than we are to ourselves," end quote. However, this sense of Christian universality is balanced by the reality of the historical specificity of the Incarnation. God has revealed himself to us in time, in the person of Jesus Christ. And as such, our communal liturgical prayer should be incarnational, Christological, quote, "turned through the incarnate word to the triune God," end quote. For this reason, quote, "the cosmic symbol of the rising sun expresses the universality of God above all particular places, and yet maintains the concreteness of divine revelation," end quote. An additional detail of theological weight found in this chapter connects us back to the state of the question regarding the arrangement of the altar. Whereas the shape and design of the altar has undergone development over time, with some of the earliest exponents being a three-columned table that appears in a 2nd century fresco and other tables made of wood, the altar was not taken to be a mere place for the re-envisioning of the paschal meal, but a place for the representation of the paschal sacrifice. As Ratzinger notes, quote, "True, the Lord established the new reality of Christian worship within the framework of a Jewish Passover meal. But it was precisely this new reality, not the meal as such, that he commanded us to repeat," end quote. Thus, Ratzinger clarifies that, quote, "this new and all-encompassing form of worship, evidenced in the church that was founded by Christ, could not be derived simply from the meal, but had to be defined through the interconnection of temple and synagogue, word and sacrament, cosmos and history," end quote. What we then find with the specification of the directionality of prayer adopted by those who officially offer it at the altar for the benefit of the church is to partake in a sacrifice rooted in temple worship, which admittedly finds its preparation by the preceding part of the liturgy that is rooted in synagogal worship. Of course, the question on many people's minds is what to do about the present moment, where the directionality of prayer at the altar has become one of the seemingly many litmus tests that have sprouted up in the contemporary church to judge one's ecclesiological motivations and vision. It is at this point, when we move from the theoretical to the practical, that we wade into dangerous territory, such that many people, understandably, try to avoid it so as not to be marked with a label that is typically, and ironically, from the standpoint of this discussion about the directionality of liturgical prayer, one-sided. Certainly, it would be a mistake to think that what Cardinal Ratzinger writes in this section of the Spirit of the Liturgy is meant to be left at the level of the theoretical. Although one might argue that since, as Pope Benedict XVI did not make any move to solidify his reflections on this topic, the topic is, in fact, an academic exercise that was not intended to be further expanded upon in the lived reality of the post-conciliar liturgical liturgy. Indeed, one might also quickly cite page 83 of this section of the work, wherein Ratzinger relates that even when there is a genuine renewal to be had, a constant activism in the liturgy, where things are rearranged all over again, could actually do more harm than good. It is in this concluding part of our chapter that we find Ratzinger offering his Tertium Quid, in which the cross is called to be placed at the center of the altar as the interior east of faith, so that both clergy and people can be united in their turning to the Lord. However, Ratzinger is not a speculative theologian, but one who, like any good father of the church, sees the realities of the past as still having a meaningful application in the present day, albeit adapted to the needs of the time to communicate better the truths of faith. One can see how this approach was lived out in his pontificate, and the attempts to bring about a deeper sense of the continuity between the pre-conciliar and post-conciliar liturgies, with each maintaining their own separate applications regarding the genius of the Roman Rite. The point of continuity pertaining to the direction of liturgical worship at the altar was not something that had to be created ex novo, as the Ordo Missae of the current Missale Romanum presumes the possibility of an ad orientem position of the priest. Similarly, the confusing language of the general instruction of the Roman Missals number 299, which says that the altar should be built separate from the wall in such a way that it is possible to walk around it easily, and that Mass can be celebrated at it facing the people, which is desirable whenever possible, receive clarification from a responsum ad dubium that the desirable whenever possible was more in reference to the altar being separate from the wall than it was to the Mass being celebrated versus populum. Thus, what Ratzinger proposes here in the spirit of the liturgy is not a rejection of the renewed liturgy called for by Sacrosanctum Concilium, but rather an outgrowth of it, and as such, something that still resonates with us today. What is key to our ever-deepening appreciation of Ratzinger's genius in approaching things liturgical is to recognize that his methodology perfectly adheres to the realms of both tradition and development. Hausling's critique of Ratzinger, that he had gone down the path of antiquarianism, is at best a gross misread of a theological mind steeped in the ancient fathers and aware of the values discovered in the living reality of the Church in the contemporary period. The man who would become Pope Benedict XVI was writing with a great appreciation of recent liturgical developments, especially those dealing with the amplification of the liturgy of the Word, as he notes on page 81 of the text. What this chapter of the spirit of the liturgy reminds us then is not to allow anything to be preferred to the work of God, so that the priority of God in the liturgy might not be eclipsed. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the entire Society for Catholic Liturgy, I'd like to thank Father Ryan Ruiz for the lecture this afternoon. As a reminder, this was the sixth in a series of monthly lectures on the spirit of the liturgy that will lead up to our annual conference on the liturgical legacy of Joseph Ratzinger-Benedict XVI in September of this year. Please visit the website of the Society for Catholic Liturgy, liturgysociety.org, for information about the conference and about membership in our society. I have placed here into our chat the link to conference information, including our call for papers. And I encourage you all to please to look at that page and to see the information, and to please consider submitting an abstract proposal, which would be due on April the 1st. I hope that you will be able to also join us for the next lecture at 4:00 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, April the 3rd, when our Society President, Father James Bradley, will address the 7th chapter of the Spirit of the Liturgy entitled The Reservation of the Blessed Sacrament. Thank you all again for joining us. May this Lenten season be a time of fruitful blessings for each one of you. Thank you.